Proszę Państwa, dzisiaj będzie rozmowa o burzy w głowie. I zanim rozwinę ten wątek, to chciałabym powiedzieć, a w zasadzie zapytać Was, czy wiecie, kim jest Brad Pitt? No podejrzewam, że większość odpowiedziała tak, no jasne, że wiem. I słuchajcie, to nie będzie rozmowa z Bradem Pittem, ale w świecie psychoterapii poznawczo-behawioralnej to jest taka osoba, takie nazwisko, które w ogóle nie budzi wątpliwości. To jest taki Brad Pitt terapii poznawczo-behawioralnej. A ta osoba nazywa się profesor David Clark i napisała książkę, genialną książkę. Uważam, że jedną z najlepszych książek do pracy z zaburzeniami lękowymi, z ruminacjami, która nazywa się właśnie Burza w Twojej głowie. Patronem tego odcinka, któremu jestem niezwykle wdzięczna, jest Gdańskie Wydawnictwo Psychologiczne, bo to właśnie oni wydali książkę Burza w Twojej głowie. Ladies and gentlemen, przed Państwem we własnej osobie, w dźwięcznym i pięknym języku angielskim rozmowa z profesorem Davidem Clarkiem. Zapomniałabym, ja się nazywam Joanna Gutral, jestem psycholożką, psychoterapeutką poznawczo-behawioralną, a ten podcast nazywa się Gutral Gada, no bo gadam. I teraz pytanie, czy ty też pogadasz? Zapraszam. All right, so I prepared some questions, and I would like to talk about the book, the Negative Thoughts Workbook that you wrote and that has been published here in Poland recently. We had, especially in social media, a flood of toxic positivity. There was all those communicates about positive vibes only, don't worry, be happy. Can negative thinking be normative sometimes? Because I feel like we got, confused with what exactly negative thinking is.
Well, first of all, I would say that negative thinking cannot be eliminated. Negative thinking is as much a part of our brain and how the brain and the mind, let's say, operate as positive thinking would be, right? So first of all, it's not possible to think only positive thoughts. Okay, that would be nice, wouldn't it? It would be, maybe it would be wonderful. Although I would contend that we need to have negative thinking in order to survive. Because there are unfortunate things, there are difficulties, losses, problems that we face in this life, and we need a balance of positive and negative thinking. So, we would certainly be in trouble in terms of being able to survive in this world if all we had was positive thinking.
So when negative thinking can become a problem, can be disturbing.
So there's some research that suggests that it's the balance between positive and negative thinking that's critical. So it's not that we want to eliminate all negative thinking, but the problem becomes when, let's say, a person has an overabundance of negative thoughts and very little positive thinking. So that's a problem. We see that in depression, for example, where people are overwhelmed with negative thoughts about themselves, their personal world, their future. And so our cognitive behavior therapy for depression helps to address that imbalance, let's say. But certainly the therapy doesn't turn someone who's depressed and has an abundance of negative thinking, it doesn't turn them into exclusively positive thinkers.
Even though patients sometimes hope for that or expect that from the therapist.
Right. They may hope for that, but it would be unrealistic, and it wouldn't prepare them for this world that we live in with all of its problems and issues and so on. And just being able to get along with each other, of course, requires a balance between positive and negative thinking. For example, you can imagine trusting people. We have to trust other people, right? And so you can think of trust as kind of a positive thought. I trust you, or you trust me, and they, think, well, he's a nice guy or she's a nice person, and probably honest, and I can put some degree of faith or trust in that person, right? That individual. But of course, we also have to be mindful that not everyone is nice and not everybody is honest, and there are people out there who will exploit and manipulate us. So we also have to have a healthy degree of mistrust and suspicion even. And that would be more on the negative side. So that would be an example of when we try to get along with each other, that we need to have both these positive, trustful thoughts, let's say, and the more negative, maybe mistrustful thoughts.
Some people are called by others, sometimes by themselves, pessimists.
Yeah.
They usually perceive future in a negative manner. Is it something we are born with, or we learn to see the world this way?
So the idea of pessimism versus optimism, right? So there's probably, I think it's fair to say there is some evidence that people, that pessimism is a type of personality characteristic, let's say. So it's probably fair to say that some people find it a lot easier to be pessimistic, and there are other people who find it a lot easier to be optimistic. Is that a result of their temperament? Is that a result of genetics or biology or upbringing or parenting or their life circumstances? I would suggest that it's probably a combination of all those things, right? So, for example, I work in my private practice. Some of my patients, a few of my patients are from the Canadian military. So these are soldiers who have, and some of them have been in Afghanistan and, other, war-torn areas of the world. And that experience changes them often. That experience, they become more pessimistic about life, about the world, about humanity in general. And that's one of the things we deal with in post-traumatic stress disorder, is that change in perspective. So that would be an example of a life experience that would maybe make you contribute to be more pessimistic. And it doesn't only have to be military. It can be any kind of traumatic experience that a person might have, like an assault or a physical or sexual assault, or anything that would, let's say, break a sense of trust we might have in important people in our lives, and so on. So that's why, for example, child sexual abuse or physical abuse can be so devastating for people because it breaks that trust, and then they develop this sense of, I can't trust anyone or anything, and so they have this kind of pessimistic outlook in general. So they expect the worst of everyone and everything.
We all live and grew up in some sort of environment, even though not all of us luckily have traumatic experiences in our past. We still grew up in some belief system. And some people believe that it's better to expect the worst. In that case, nothing bad can surprise us. Are there any benefits from this type of approach? How it's happening that we believe in, for example, the magic or supportive benefits from being worried all the time? Right.
So worry, and actually that brings us to one of the chapters in the book and I've got a chapter on worry. And it's interesting, often people will have a positive belief about worry, not only just a negative belief, but they can have a positive belief about worry. In other words, that worry's preparing them somehow for the very worst. Now, the difficulty with that is often worry doesn't really prepare you, because what happens is that in the worry process, the person isn't usually doing a good job at problem solving. They're not coming up with solutions to things, because what happens in worry, you're always catastrophizing. You're always thinking about the very worst that can happen. And so usually in life, it's not the very worst that happens, but it might be something more towards the middle, not positive, maybe something that's difficult or negative, but not necessarily the catastrophe. So you're spending all your time on the catastrophe and really not dealing with something that's more likely to happen. And there's some research to suggest that up to 85% of the things that we worry about never end up being as bad as we think they will be, right? And even if the bad outcome happens, let's say the bad thing does happen, that we're better able to prepare for it than we thought we would. And a good example of this is I have patients who have what we call health anxiety. So let's say they're worried about cancer. And that's a big one. Of course, we're in the midst right now of a pandemic, so we can worry about that as well. But, cancer is a problem, a disease that's been with us for many, many, many years, right? Decades, probably centuries. And so it's common for people to worry about cancer. I've had patients who are young people who are in perfect health, great health, and yet they may be worried about cancer. And one of the things is that they catastrophize, and what a terrible thing this would be. Well, sometimes what happens is, unfortunately, an individual does receive a positive diagnosis of cancer, let's say, and now they have to deal with it. They're better able to deal with that cancer, let's say, than they imagined they'd be able to deal with it when they were worrying and in good health.
Yeah, so I ask you about worrying because this is something that is very close to me because my grandma is excellent in worrying. My mom is great in being worried all the time. And I remember how frustrating it was because whenever I was going even to something really exciting, like a school party or whatever, they were like, oh, be careful, think about this, like, let me know when you will be home, let me know, like, who is driving you back. Right. And there were all those catastrophes, even though I was going for, like, a really exciting event. And now, recently, I realized that I use the same communicate to the people I love, and I was like, I'm starting doing the same thing. Is loving by worrying a good type of relationship? Well,
all of us, I think most of us can think of family members who are professional worriers, right?
Yes.
And in the interesting thing, they didn't have to go to school or any special university to learn how to worry.
Although they have a degree with that, like they are absolutely good at it.
Very, very good, right? Very professional with it. So worry is something that's around us. All of us do some worry. I mean, if somebody said to you, I've never worried in my life, I don't know what you mean by worry, you probably wouldn't believe them. You'd go, are you serious? You've never worried about anything? So we all worry, right? But I make a distinction, and most of my colleagues make a distinction between normal worry. Sometimes worry can be even helpful, right? So, for example, let's say you've got a project at work that you're working on, and there's a deadline, and there's a part of the project that you're stuck on. You don't quite know how to solve this problem or whatever. And you start thinking about it a lot, let's say. You could say, I'm worried about this part of the project. I don't know if my thinking is quite right. Maybe my research isn't good enough or whatever. You might worry about it. And then what you might do is the next day or two, you would then go and work on it even harder. You might go to a colleague and get some help with it or consultation, or you might do some more research. In other words, worrying about it helped you to solve that problem. But unhelpful or harmful worry doesn't do that. So in harmful worry, what we do is we're like spinning our wheels. We're just getting ourselves more and more anxious because we're stuck on a catastrophe and we can't seem to let go of it. And so anything that appears like a solution, we immediately dismiss and say, well, that's not good enough, and so on. And so we throw it out. So we make a distinction between helpful worry and harmful worry. Now, you raised a good point, which is I've had an example of this where people can sometimes wear their worry, as we say in English, as a badge of honor. They're like almost proud that they're worrying. And I've had this with some young mothers, so mothers with young children. And I've had several who would worry about their children. Let's say the child is 5, 6, 7 years old. So, and they're at school and they're in the playground and they're worried all the time. What if my child gets injured? What if they fall off the swings? And sometimes, in fact, I've had on occasion where a mother will phone the school, which is not a good thing because the teachers don't want to be, interrupted with worried parents calling, is my child okay? Are they, and you may be constantly saying, oh, don't climb on the what we call monkey bars, or don't climb up in the playground. That's dangerous. And they're always, very cautious about that. I'm worried about it. They say, well, because I'm so worried about my child, that makes me a good mother. That means I love my child. And so sometimes what I'll say is, well, do you have a friend, another woman who's a young mother, who doesn't worry about her children's harm and safety? And invariably they always say, oh yes, I have a friend, Mary, and Mary doesn't worry about her kids and so on. And I said, do your children, or I usually reverse it, I say, does Mary's children get hurt more than your children? No, Mary's children don't get hurt more. And in fact, this worried mother's children may still fall off the swing, may still get a scraped knee or a bruised elbow, may even hit their head, which is unfortunate because children play. So all that worrying, which this parent thinks is protecting the child and is a sign of their love, really isn't that helpful at all.
So I have a friend who is always asking her husband to text her when he will get to work, to wherever he was supposed to go. And whenever he is not texting her, she automatically sees a car accident and him being injured pretty bad. There is no other way why he didn't text her. And I very often see them arguing about him not texting her and her being upset with him that he didn't thought about her feelings. I think that this worrying part can be very difficult for the relationship because the basic miscommunication is he thinks that she's over-controlling. She thinks that she is loving him so much and trying to make sure that he is extra safe. How we can solve this issue, and it doesn't need to be marriage. Any significant person we are in a relationship it can be frustrating on both ends.
Absolutely. And that's a great example that you give, where worry is not only a problem for the worrier, for the person who's doing the worry, but it also affects family members, and it can affect your relationships with with your partner, your spouse, or with your children, or whatever. And the interesting thing about that example, so there's two things I'd like to mention about that. One is by saying, would you text me? I hope he's not texting and driving at the same time. That, because it could increase the probability of having an accident. So the very thing that she is worried about, the strategy, which is, okay, text me, could actually cause an accident to happen. Right? Because let's say he forgets to text, or he gets distracted or whatever, and he goes, oh, I better text her, and instead of pulling over, he's late for an appointment. Maybe he does. Maybe I'll just give her a quick text or whatever. And so that could be dangerous. The other thing is that worry is always, you could think of it this way, worry is a bit selfish. in that it's all about the way you feel. So worry is about feeling. And I would say in this case, what it is this person, this wife or spouse or whatever, she's feeling anxious about her husband and his driving. So she has these thoughts, well, in the book we call repetitive negative thoughts, which, this thought pops into her mind, I hope he's not in an accident. And what's the best way to calm down and to get rid of the anxious thought or the worry thought, which is to get a text from him saying, I'm okay, or I'm at work now or wherever. So it's all about relieving her anxiety, let's say, and actually dealing with that worry thought, getting it out of your mind, being able to think about something else. It's not so much about him.
I talked to this friend, and I actually convey her to attend the psychotherapy. And after a couple sessions, she said, I understand what types of mistakes I'm making, but it's still very difficult to stop feeling so anxious about it. Does your book help in any sort of way with homeworks that can help you stand by from session to session?
Right. So what we would do, and there are some exercises in the workbook for that, but the ultimate, not solution, but let's say the ultimate goal in treatment would be to help her to tolerate her anxiety, her discomfort, her concern about her husband, and to what we often call is to sit with the anxiety and the distress. And it will go away if you sit with it a bit, okay? And what you do with the worry thoughts is that you can say, okay, identify what it is that you're worried about, okay? So I am worried that my partner will have an accident, okay? So then in the workbook, we say, okay, what's the likelihood of your partner having an accident? Is he a terrible driver? Has he had many accidents in the past? Wherever he lives, maybe somewhere in Poland, are they all dangerous drivers on the road? How many accidents do you have on the road? What's the probability of an accident? And then the second thing you can say is, okay, am I overestimating the likelihood or the probability of an accident? And then secondly, am I assuming the very worst? So probably she's assuming, some horrendous multi-car accident and he's lying on the pavement and he's bleeding and he's half dead and all of this just terrible thing. But in fact, a lot of accidents are what we call in the US and in Canada fender benders. They're just, people don't necessarily get hurt. Is she thinking about that kind of accident? Well, probably not. She's thinking of the death and injury and, the very worst type of accident possible. And so we say, okay, I'm exaggerating the probability and I'm exaggerating the severity. What is more likely to happen? It's more likely that my partner will be stuck in a traffic jam and will be late for work because of a traffic jam, not because of an accident.
Let's think about the other person in a relationship where someone is constantly worried. How can I effectively set some sort of boundaries not to be affected by someone being worried so much?
And that one's a very difficult one to do because the family member who's not worried is thinking about life in a particular way, a certain way. So they're not thinking about accidents, they're not thinking about death and injury and all of this stuff. And so it's easy for that person to say, well, stop worrying. Don't worry about it. The very worst thing to say to a worrier is stop worrying. Don't worry. Because what you're doing is, of course, they don't want to worry. See, there's two levels to worry. On the one hand, you could kind of, think of worry in a positive way. It means that I love you. It means, that I really care and that I'm a sensitive person and so on. But most worriers often hate worrying. They don't want to worry. It winds them up. They get distressed. They're pacing around. They can't concentrate on anything else because they're stuck in their head. They're stuck on worrying. So they don't want to worry. So when you say stop worrying, right, you're telling them something they already know. They wish they could stop worrying. And then if I'm a worrier, I would say, well, how are you going to help me to stop worrying then? So that's the first thing. You can't tell them. They have to, the worry person has to come to it themselves and say, you know what, I need to approach my fears and my anxiety and always thinking about catastrophes. I need to do something about this. I need help with this. I need a different approach. And so one of the most successful things that interventions, and this is an American psychologist by the name of Professor Borgovec, Thomas Borgovec, years ago, he actually scheduled for people to have worry sessions. Okay? So intentionally worry. Now, when you look at it, that doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? If you're already a worrier and you say to the person, okay, well, why don't you worry then? That doesn't make a lot of sense because they're already worrying. But what you do with worry exposure is you say, okay, set aside a certain time of day. Often it's in the evening. And get a quiet place, sit in a chair. Don't have your phone around you. Don't have the television on. No screens, no iPads, nothing. Sit and maybe you have a list. And okay, so start worrying about it. Just let your mind go and just worry, right? And now what I do is I often say to people, worry and then have the alternative to the worry. Remember I said, worry is about things that are not very likely to happen. And so maybe you could have the thing that's most likely to happen. It's most likely, if we take your example about worried about your partner who is driving and will have an accident, probably he's in a traffic jam, right? So you think about the traffic jam and what it's like to be in the traffic jam. Then you go back to the worry. And so on, you do that for 20 minutes, half hour, and then end your session with some breathing and kind of relaxing, and then go do something. Go do something. Go do an errand or, clean the house or, fix something in the yard or whatever. If you're in Canada this time of year, you could go and shovel snow. But whatever, you do something, right? And then the next day you go back and do it again. Now, here's the thing that happens. Miraculously, it seems like the worry, you deflate the worry. The worry becomes less emotional, less powerful, doesn't grip you quite as much. And I think there are a couple of reasons for that. One is you're taking control of the worry. So, for example, in therapy, I've had patients who've said to me, I worry all the time. I said, well, what do you worry about? And they're, well, I'm worried about my health. I'm worried about my children and so on. So I said, okay, for the next few minutes, I'd like you to worry. I want you to worry about your kids right now. And then they'll go, like, what do you mean right now? And then, in the therapy session, you want me to worry? And I say, yeah, just start worrying. I mean, you tell me you worry for hours on end. So how about if you do 5 or 10 minutes of worry right here, right now? And I stop talking and I take my phone and I put it on, stopwatch and say, okay, worry. And so they look at me and they kind of look up. And I said, do you need to close your eyes? No, I'm not going to close my eyes, they say, So they sit there. And I've not, in decades, I've never had a patient who is able to worry. They go, I can't do it. I said, what do you mean you can't do it? You do it all day long. Do it for me now. I'd like to see you worry. And what I ask is to worry out loud, you know, so I can hear their thoughts, let's say. They can't do it. So why? Well, they're taking control of the worry. And when you take control of the worry like that, it just kind of strips it of a lot of its emotion and its power. Even with something as bad as death and life-threatening illness or death of a loved one or cancer, you go, okay, I'm going to think about this now. You go, well, what would I do? Well, there's nothing I can do. If a loved one passes away, I can't stop death. You know, we're all going to die at some point, right? So you can't stop it. And so you start thinking about that. Well, what can I do? And there's like an acceptance that starts to build. So that's a very powerful intervention, actually, for worry.
I really like this intervention, and I really like the first look that patients give when you actually ask them to start worrying. They are not quite sure if they are in the right place with the right person, but usually it works pretty well.
Yeah, they wonder, okay, so what's the trick here? You know, is there some kind of trick? Are you trying to trick me or something? They say, no, it's just, you know, you say you worry all the time. It should come quite easily. And it's not the same. It's never the same.
What negative thinking can cause in our mental health and well-being? Of course, I'm talking about this overwhelming, intense negative thinking.
So in the book, in the Negative Thoughts Workbook, we're talking about kind of what we call repetitive negative thinking. So these are thoughts that kind of pop into your mind. You don't want to necessarily think about them. And so we say they're kind of passive in the sense that, you know, like you and I, we're talking to each other and we're doing this interview. And so we have to kind of focus our attention on what we're saying and what we're thinking. So this is very active thinking, right? You know, attention's focused on it. But with repetitive negative thinking, it's kind of passive. So the thoughts just kind of come to us, let's say. It's a very self-focused. So when the thought gets in our head, we become focused in on it, and it becomes very difficult to control. So you think of this, worry is a great example of a repetitive negative thought, because most people don't go, oh, let me see, it's 2 p.m. I think I better start worrying. I haven't worried for the last hour, right? They just find themselves worrying, right? So it just kind of pops into their mind. Another type of repetitive negative thought is what we call rumination. And it's the same sort of thing. So you can think of worry as worried about possibilities. What if? It's always about the future. Rumination is about the past, things that have happened to us in the past, usually unpleasant things, difficult things, and we can't stop thinking about it, right? And so, again, you could spend a lot of time in rumination. Why did this happen to me? Why did this bad thing happen to me? Was it my fault? Should I have anticipated this? You know, could I have done something different? You know, and so on. And then you kind of keep trying to, in rumination, you often try to resolve some kind of issue, like why this happened to me. And so we find rumination is common in depression. So let's say, you know, you lose your job, and it's maybe you've been working someplace for quite some time, and then this terrible thing happens and you lose your job. Maybe there's some what we call downsizing, you know, maybe the company is laying off people, made redundant, and now you're without a job. And you might be there. Some people kept their job and some people lost their job. And now you're thinking, why did I lose my job? How come I was one of the ones who lost my job? What did I do wrong? Wasn't I working hard enough? Wasn't my work good enough? Did I say something to my boss that maybe annoyed her and she decided to let me go?
It very often also happens with the relationships. Why did he leave me? Why he broke up with me? What did I do wrong?
What did I do wrong? And yes, exactly. What could I have done differently? Sometimes when in a relationship, when there's infidelity, like so the person, your partner has another relationship, and then you start blaming yourself and you say, well, is it my fault? Maybe that's why, he or she, sought out love and intimacy with someone else. And so then absolutely. So that becomes a source of rumination. They get very depressed about it. And so then what happens is that the rumination can kind of also combine with worry, where then the person says, will I be single the rest of my life? Will I live the rest of my life without love? Alone, abandoned, and so that becomes part of the kind of the thinking as well. But it's all repetitive. It's all negative thinking. It pops into your mind. You get stuck in it. It's like once that you start thinking about it, you can't stop. I often refer to it as sticky thinking. Professor Rackman, a British psychologist, he would talk about sticky thoughts, thoughts that kind of stick in your head and you can't get rid of them. And repetitive negative thoughts are like that. And then once they stick there, they're very, very hard to control, right? It's very hard to distract yourself, right? So we find this type of thinking happening in depression in the form of rumination. We find it in anxiety in the form of worry. But then there are other negative emotions that I talk about in the book that also have repetitive negative thoughts. And one of them is regret, so people regret. They have this, and so regret is an emotion that occurs when we feel like we missed an opportunity, right? So I give the example of someone, let's say, who's in university and in a program. And I've had patients like this. And so let's say the woman, decides to leave university and she, she gets a job and maybe supports this man or this partner or person she's seen, and they're living together. And, so she decides to stop the university, her education, in order to support the family or to support them as a couple. Well, maybe later on, 10, 15 years later, maybe she regrets that decision because she never did go back to school. And now she doesn't have a career or a job, and she feels stuck and she feels kind of depressed, and she thinks back, I regret that. I should never have stopped my education. We should have tried to figure out some other way. So that would be an example of a regret. And there are many. The longer one lives, the more opportunity there is to make decisions, and then we regret. We feel we've missed an opportunity.
How do you work with regret? Because you cannot, go back and change the decisions. You have what you have and you still regret. How you can work with that? Right.
And so where the repetitive thinking comes in is the person keeps going back in time in their head, and they think, why did I decide to do that? Why didn't I go to university, or why didn't I take that job? And here's another example, sometimes where people will have a job offer, let's say in another city, and they don't take it, and they decide to stay in their home city or their hometown around family. And then later on they regret that, and they think, well, that would have been such a much better job, and I would have felt much more fulfilled in that job, and so on. So that's a regret. So what happens is then they keep thinking about that, right? They keep thinking about that job and the decision and the missed opportunity. So what we do is that the error that is made in regret is the person is assuming that they have the same degree of insight and knowledge in the present. They're assuming they have that same insight and knowledge when they were trying to make the decision in the past. And of course, they didn't have that, right? So, so what we try to do is work with people and say, did you make the best decision at the time? And really try to help patients go back in time and say, well, when you decided to take that job, and not to take a second job, let's say. So you decided to take job A and you declined job B. Were you thinking to yourself at the time, I'm going to make the worst decision I can? Right? Well, no, right? They were making what they thought was the best decision. And now 10 years later, they realize it wasn't the best decision. So we really try to help people to be, in a sense, kinder towards themselves, a bit more compassionate, and say, well, you need to, with regret, you need to say, okay, I did the best that I could at that time. If you can get yourself to that point and say, I did the best of from what I knew at that time, you'll be more forgiving towards yourself and less regretful.
Your book in Poland, the title is translated literally to The Storm in Your Head. That's the title of your book here in Poland,
okay.
A little bit more poetic.
Yes.
How this self-help book can help us to survive that storm?
So survive the distortion, you mean? Like, our distorted thinking?
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Okay. So one of the things that we really try to do in cognitive behavior therapy, whether we're talking about worry or rumination or regret or shame or resentment, all of the different chapters in the book deal with those different emotions. But one of the things that's common is that we try to help people to test their thoughts against real life, against their experience. So it's not about the therapist trying to convince you of some particular truth or reality, but it's rather the therapist helping you to be able to use your own experience to correct your thinking. Let's take shame, for example. So there's a chapter on shame and humiliation. So shame is a very, very powerful emotion. It's one of the most upsetting emotions we can have. And I don't, if your listeners have ever felt shame, they know exactly what I'm talking about. It's awful. So what makes shame so difficult is it's a very public type of thing. You don't normally feel shame in private. You feel shame in public around other people. And usually what happens is the distorted thinking in shame is that whatever you did that was an embarrassment, and that's what shame is, when you realize you've embarrassed yourself, that in fact that people will often forget about that embarrassing thing, that it won't really change how they think about you in time. So if you do something embarrassing with your friends, let's say you say something and you realize, it wasn't the nicest thing to say or the wisest thing to say, and you're kind of embarrassed by it. Maybe you disclosed a secret that you were supposed to keep to yourself, and then you realize you did, and you feel ashamed about doing that. The fact is that usually over time, people just forget about that. They just disappear, particularly your friends and people who know you. It just becomes one experience of 100 or 1,000 experiences they have with you. Now, if you kept, disclosing secrets over and over again, and you were the type of person who couldn't be trusted to keep a secret, that's a different story. But usually shame is not about stuff we do repeatedly over and over and over again. Usually it's about one thing that we've done, one big embarrassment. And we can't stop thinking about it. And we can't stop thinking about how people must now look down on us or think of us as not a particularly good person. And that's where the distortion comes in, that probably these people aren't thinking that way about you. They might scratch their head and go, wow, that was not a very good thing to say, or boy, did he ever embarrass himself or we often have a phrase in English, put your foot in your mouth, you've said something that's a bit awkward or let's say unkind and you're embarrassed. But usually that goes. People don't remember that. It's not important to them. It's important to you, and you remember it. And it's not so important to them. So that's what we work with in shame. So that's how we try to help somebody who's struggling with shame to correct that distorted thinking.
For more tips and techniques and exercises, I would highly encourage our listeners to check the book of Professor David Clark, which in English is called The Negative Thoughts Workbook, in Poland, Burza w Twojej głowie, The Storm in Your Head. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It was a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you.
Thank you.